Good afternoon. This is WYZT 104.7 Crab Radio. Today we're here with the Chesapeake Research Consortium discussing the Chesapeake Bay Watershed.
Hi, my name is Henry Tang, and we're here with Crab Radio. This is Deja Baker and Julian Ladome. We're here with the Chesapeake Research Consortium at Chesapeake Bay Program. And would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Drew Pizzala. I work for the Chesapeake Research Consortium at the Chesapeake Bay Program.
My name is Darius Stanton, and I also work at the Chesapeake Research Consortium at the Chesapeake Bay Program office.
I'm Kara Skipper, and I work at the Chesapeake Research Consortium at the Chesapeake Bay Program.
My name is Kyle Hinson. I work with the Chesapeake Research Consortium, Chesapeake Bay Program.
My name is Catherine Wares, and I also work at the Chesapeake Research Consortium at the Chesapeake Bay Program.
So Darius, what do you work on?
So I'm with the Chesapeake Research Consortium as the Diversity Workgroup staffer. Last year, the Bay Program did a profile of the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership and its partners. So the Chesapeake Bay Program is a 6-state and including DC, so 7 jurisdictions wide program that looks at water quality across the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And so specifically my job looks at the diversity across the watershed. So diversity looking at from a geographical standpoint, ethnicity and race, rural and urban, age, leadership, non-leadership, sexual orientation. Specifically, I work to just increase diversity across a number of different measures through outreach and communication, professional development, environmental justice initiatives, and tracking and assessing.
What would you say that has to do with the oyster population?
One thing about my work specifically is that it's a misconception that only scientists are supposed to be involved in water quality or within the health of the bay. You know, it's a misconception that only engineers or researchers are supposed to be involved in this conversation. But my job is to really help find creative ways to connect those that don't always traditionally think about the bay in one vein, and connecting them to programs such as oyster restoration projects, oyster outreach or awareness projects. So if, for example, there's a big oyster event that would be going on, or awareness event or cleanup event, it would be my job to kind of help reach non-traditional environmental organizations to get them involved in that program.
One big part of the stewardship goal implementation team that I'm a part of is environmental literacy goal. And with that, we're trying to increase the amount of environmental literacy across the watershed. So just like you said, just getting some of these messages across to students at an early age, instilling the sense of environmental stewardship, teaching them ways to take care of the environment, easy things they can do on an individual level, as well as how they can influence others in taking on similar behavior. Okay, so how do we reach those younger audiences? Okay, so one way is we have an environmental literacy goal as part of the stewardship goal implementation team, and that is increasing awareness for environmental literacy around the watershed, trying to promote more environmental education programs in schools. So we have different curricula that we online. For example, baybackpack.com is a resource that houses a lot of professional development opportunities, different resources that talk about different water quality issues, any environmental issues that are accessible to teachers that they can then teach to their students. So we have programs like Kids in Kayaks, which takes place at North Point State Park in Baltimore, Maryland. And selected schools have the opportunity to go out in kayaks. They go through different stations, whether it be a water quality station, testing for water clarity. They will have stations where they might look at fish and identify different fish. And then really just learn about the big picture of what all these things mean. Like as these fish, whatever fish are present, that's an indicator of the health of that watershed, that bay. And same with the water quality. So if the water looks really bad in the Patapsco River, then what does this mean for the Chesapeake Bay? Because there's just like this interconnectedness. So it really helps just spread that awareness and really learn that this watershed is one big thing, all the land around it, all the surrounding streams, rivers that flow into this Chesapeake Bay. So it's just really important to understand the big picture on how everything affects one another. I would say a watershed encompasses all of the surrounding lands, streams, rivers, everything that flows into this one body. It's just important to understand that the Chesapeake Bay, the watershed really does encompass more than just the water itself in the bay.
And so it starts in New York and ends in Virginia, or it ends in the Chesapeake Bay, but it spans down to Virginia and West Virginia. So a lot of our work doesn't only span within Maryland per se. It really looks at that entire watershed from New York all the way down to Virginia, West Virginia.
Right. Yeah, so it's the largest estuary in the United States. So an estuary, the easiest way that I learned what an estuary was, it was basically where the river meets the sea. So where freshwater body comes into contact with salt water.
Right.
It's important that kids get this at an early age because they will be the future stewards, and those who are relied upon to take care of the environment, whether it's in their professional life or, it takes more than that. It takes just individual stewardship behavior just on a daily basis, just knowing, to recycle, doing simple things like that, picking up after your pet, all these small things, but really do add up to one, larger picture. So, I was really interested in the Bay from an early age. I grew up loving to fish, kayak, hike, really anything that involved the water and being outside. So I had a very early relationship with the Chesapeake Bay. And with that, it just instilled in me a feeling to always want to protect it. So that's why I went to school. I became an environmental studies major at Washington College, and just continued that further understanding more of the science and research that goes into protecting the bay. And then just getting started, took on an internship as a Chesapeake Conservation Corps volunteer, where I worked with a stewardship team and research team to go out on the water, do different water quality monitoring, look at the effects that are happening in marshland, doing different bird studies, and just seeing what these meant, how these environmental factors really influence their behavior, and just their lives in general. And that always was fun to me as well, so it was great to be able to enjoy what I was doing, meanwhile also helping to educate others, and then just protect a resource that I love and that's near and dear to my heart. And then that led me to where I am now as at the Chesapeake Research Consortium, working for the BATE program, looking at this on an even higher scale from a policy level, like passing this down to those organizations who go and do those implementation activities and make those physical changes.
So my dad, he worked with the Boys and Girls Club my whole entire life growing up, and so I always connected whatever I wanted to do towards helping people or helping youth. And so my 12th grade year in high school, I took AP Environmental Science, and I really connected the dots between social and environmental issues and how interconnected they were. And so I really saw that. I actually went to a STEM high school as well. I went to Eleanor Roosevelt High School in Greenbelt, Maryland. And so I quickly identified that that was the route that I wanted to take. Since then, just as far as water quality goes, we see issues like Flint, New Orleans and Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, how that's impacted our country and, different communities across the country. And I just think that, I really have wanted to really find a way, in my own lane to help mitigate those issues and really help prevent that in other places across not only the country, but hopefully the world.
The Chesapeake Bay program has a goal to restore 10 tributaries in the Chesapeake Bay, and that's to get the oyster population to about 50% or more of what is currently restorable bottom. But they have one completed at this time. It's Harris Creek on the eastern shore of Maryland, and at this point they've put in, I believe, over 200 acres of oysters.
Wow.
They're going to continue doing that. The goal is to have all 10 completed by 2025. In doing so, they're going to both improve the water quality and hopefully bring back more of the fisheries in those areas.
Right. So what does being part of the Chesapeake Research Consortium mean to you?
It's really a great opportunity to start connecting with different stakeholders for the Chesapeake Bay. We work a lot with scientists, academics, managers, as well as the different community members who are all invested in the Chesapeake Bay. My interest really stemmed from blue crabs. When I was a child, I used to crab all the time. We would fish and crab off my grandfather's dock. I started to see a change in the Chesapeake Bay pretty early on. When my sister and I would crab as children, we would get maybe 2 full 5-gallon buckets of crabs in a single morning. And we did this for like over a decade, and probably by the time maybe like the early 2000s, it was down to maybe 2-3 crabs. It was dramatically lower just in that small period of time. And that's what really drew me to working for the Bay, to try and restore that so that future generations could have the same experience that I had.
So my work is primarily more abstract, I guess, than a lot of my colleagues here, because I work with the modeling side of both the watershed and the bay. We take data that's collected for water quality and water clarity in streams and rivers and throughout the bay, and look at nutrient levels, sediment levels, and then try to actually model it so we could project what the bay might look like in the future. To try and assess what the future will look like for the Chesapeake Bay based on what we do today to put in restoration practices or put oyster shells in different tributaries, we use a model. And this includes both one that covers the entire airshed of the Chesapeake Bay, which goes way out to the Midwest. The power plants in Ohio actually deposit nitrogen onto the bay surface and throughout the watershed. That's expected to change over time as different chemical reactions go on in the atmosphere. We model the watershed. What do farmers put on their cover crops, or how much fertilizer do they apply, or what do cities do to increase pollution and runoff to the bay? And then we look at what actually happens within the bay. Under a future scenario of sea level rise, for example, how much more water coming into the bay from the sea will help to provide more oxygen to the lower depths. So I'm specifically looking at a project where we are bringing in increased temperatures, changes in precipitation, and changes in evapotranspiration, or how much plants breathe and release water vapor back in the atmosphere, for both 2025 and 2050. And the results are pretty remarkable. Once we produce model outputs, we take this to managers to help them determine where they can essentially get the biggest bang for their buck. If they choose to put in a bunch of rain gardens, or all around their city, how much pollution can they reduce from an urban area, or how much can a farmer reduce his or her runoff by planting crops at a certain time of the year, or reducing fertilizer usage, for example. There are actually many citizen monitoring groups around the watershed where really anyone with a smartphone can go out and join these groups, help take measurements, and provide data that helps to inform our model and our monitoring program, and adds to our already 20 or 30-year record of data. To be honest, before I moved to Maryland, because I grew up a lot in North Carolina, I had only heard of the Chesapeake Bay in passing and knew there was supposed to be some really big dead zones somewhere. So I was extremely unfamiliar with it. But then I started doing work looking at data and modeling how estuaries in North Carolina interacted and what problems they were facing there. And so when I moved to Maryland, and the same job that Drew actually had with the Chesapeake Conservation Corps, I became more intimately knowledgeable about rain gardens and other practices that regular homeowners were taking on all over Annapolis and throughout the watershed. From there, my passion for sort of modeling this stuff kind of took over, and at the Chesapeake Research Consortium, I'm allowed to really explore what happens to air deposition, what happens because of climate change, and sort of tinkering with what goes on everywhere. We're creating these sort of strange and disaster-like scenarios in the future, but you still get to go out and enjoy what there is now and kayak around, explore the creeks, and really appreciate what there is today.
A dead zone is an area in an aquatic system where there is very low dissolved oxygen, and maybe to the point of low enough that species can't survive in that habitat.
So there's no life in those areas?
Yeah, oftentimes there's no life, and it also increases competition in areas that have higher DO. So it's bad for fish species in multiple ways. And a rain garden is usually a depression-like garden, which is designed to collect all the water from the surrounding impervious area and be able to dry out within 24 to 48 hours.
So it just collects water, really?
Exactly. So if there's a lot of impervious surface around, like driveways or sidewalks, it'll collect that water instead of allowing it to pool and possibly be a place where mosquitoes can grow, and flooding or any type of kind of property damage will occur. So it'll collect that water in a place where the plants can absorb it. Usually native plants are used to help make it more beneficial for the surrounding wildlife and drain the water. It's a great way that any homeowner can help improve their environment.
And yeah, so the Bay program definitely promotes rain gardens just because it really helps to decrease the amount of pollutants from things such as cars or lawn mowing or pesticides. You know, a lot of those things that usually come just because of roads and roadways and sidewalks. Rain gardens catch a lot of those pollutants, and then they catch them within those native plants, so they're not going directly into storm water, which goes out to the bay. So I know a lot of companies are really starting to think in a more sustainable manner, and so things such as like buildings being LEED certified, a lot of those buildings that are like LEED silver, LEED gold, LEED platinum, they're starting to take into consideration how to catch some of those pollutants. So I think it depends upon the companies.
More cars that are electric or produce fewer emissions help to reduce nitrogen runoff to the bay, one of the main nutrients that helps to lead to these dead zones forming. So the more you can carpool or ride a bike, take public transit, the more you can actually do to help reduce emissions, not just greenhouse gas emissions, which contribute to the bay in other ways, but also to just nitrogen oxide.
Okay, and then just another thing to add to that also with the biking, there's different bike share programs that are getting really big now in major cities, where, for just a very small amount of money, one can take a bike, whether they're going to work, to school, and then return that bike at a different location, and that's also a way that's cutting down on a lot of driving. So, carpooling when possible, but no emissions are better than fewer emissions, so always taking that route. So another thing with rain gardens, we're also seeing more implementation of these different projects on school grounds. There's different stormwater programs where with the buildings and grounds, they're actually helping their students design different rain gardens and just different things around their school grounds to help reduce runoff, planting more native plants and having these depressions, just reducing the amount of impervious surfaces, whether driveway, sidewalk, and when they do these, some of them are also pervious, so water can actually be absorbed into the pavement. So we just see any increase in green infrastructure kind of around the board. So whether that's happening in cities, it's also happening from school grounds, and they're teaching kids about this at an early age as well.
So I am the Healthy Watershed staffer at the Chesapeake Bay program, and so the goal of our team is to sustain 100% of the healthy watersheds in the greater Chesapeake Bay watershed. So basically our job is to keep healthy areas healthy. So a lot of what we do is kind of trying to create tools that local governments and watershed organizations can use, either retain the forest land within their healthy watershed or create policies that can do that or protect the area. And so I also work with the Forest Service at the Chesapeake Bay program. And so a lot of the work that we do there is trying to either plant more riparian forest buffers or preserve the ones that we have. A riparian forest buffer is basically when there are trees along a body of water that are able to kind of filter the pollutants that are coming off of the land. So a lot of that is working with farmers and landowners to help them monetarily or in maintenance of getting these trees planted and keeping the trees growing and healthy and doing all of the good work that they do.
So is it like a government-funded program, or is it just like private?
So a lot of it is government funded. So buffers in specifically, a lot of USDA funds help with that because a lot of the forest buffers are planted on farms. Okay. So there's incentives for farmers to plant that. The government will give them grants to kind of offset whatever money they would have made from planting along the stream, giving them money for what they would have lost to plant those trees.
So what does being part of this team really mean to you?
So I grew up in Maryland on the Monocacy River, which is a tributary to the bay, and so I loved the river growing up there. And as I got older, the area where I lived just kind of became more developed, suburban neighborhoods, coming in and all of that. And seeing all of the different changes that caused, to the river and to just the wildlife around was upsetting as like a child. If you don't have frogs to catch anymore, that's like a big deal as a kid. So when I went to college, I studied environmental science. I also went to Washington College, which is on the Chester River, another tributary to the bay. So a lot of my education there was focused on specifically the Chesapeake Bay and the environmental issues relating to it. So from all of that education, and learning all this stuff about the bay, I definitely wanted to stay in the area and do something that could help. And my specific job with, Healthy Watersheds is being able to protect areas like where I grew up,
Right.
so that kids can keep catching frogs and keep swimming in, the rivers without, any harm. So within the whole Chesapeake Bay watershed, a long time ago, the majority of the area was forest, and over time, a lot of it got converted to agriculture, and more recently, it's being converted to more urban or suburban areas. So land use changes are a big thing that factor the Chesapeake Bay. So the conversion of, wetlands and forest land to these rural areas increases the amount of stormwater runoff and the pollutants that are coming into the bay, whereas, these wetland and forest areas are able to filter pollutants, and they also provide habitat for a lot of the wildlife within the watershed.
Are there ways we can grow these forests back?
So there are, as I said, these programs that help to incentivize farmers and landowners. It doesn't have to be just farmers, but any landowner who is by a stream or a river can apply for these grants that will help them plant more trees or bring back forests in their area.
So through the government, is there a website they could go to?
Yeah, so USDA and the U.S. Forest Service, both of them have programs. One of them, there's a lot of acronyms in the government, but CREP, CRP and CREP, and EQIP, EQIP. I don't remember what they stand for, but they're the three big grant programs.
So building off what Catherine said, land use change is another facet of what we tried to use to predict what a future bay might look like. Back when Captain John Smith first landed here, it was, the same with something like a squirrel could jump from tree to tree from the edge of the bay until he got to the Mississippi River. We've lost so much more forest since then through agriculture and development. So we run these scenarios in our models. What would happen if we moved the entire population out of the watershed, we reforested all the cities and tore up all the roads? What would that do to the bay? Or we have another scenario where what if this development goes on and it's unmitigated, there's nothing stopping it. What does that do to the dead zone in the bay? And then we have things like these conservation projects and places that can't ever be developed. They're sort of held in perpetuity as sort of this reserve. And how does that affect the bay? Or how does that affect just local streams and waterways throughout the watershed? We use multiple models to try and develop these estimates. We get input from stakeholders throughout the bay, different state-level managers. We have, I think, 3 or 4 different agricultural models just to figure out what happens to an acre of corn when it's fertilized and rain falls on top of it. We're sort of showing how we can sustainably manage our watershed without these drastic consequences. The population in the bay has increased. It's doubled in the past 20 years, and we've still seen improvements in bay water quality.
Sure. So, it's a lot of ways that youth can get involved if they want to get experience in natural science or environmental work. I know one thing is if you're not in high school involved in one of the STEM-related programs, I would definitely say volunteer with your local environmental groups. They not only will give you their hands-on experience, but they'll also help you create a network with people that are definitely involved and have schooling and can tell you good schools to go to as far as college for that. At the collegiate level, I would definitely say, study something. You don't have to study specifically environmental science to get involved in environmental science work, but you do want to have some type of experience in either research or natural sciences or a way to connect into it, even if you're on the art side. So I would say, from my vantage point, I took in undergrad, environmental science was my major, and my minor was political science. At first I wanted to be an environmental lawyer, but I also did research looking at biofuel feedstock. So basically, which plants could be the best plants to use for biofuel production. Um, and so I think, just looking at certain classes, depending upon your interests, you can be in environmental science, environmental policy courses, toxicology courses, ecology, marine sciences, but you need that foundation as far as biology, chemistry, physics, math, and then modeling is very important too.
All around the Chesapeake Bay, I think mostly in Maryland, they have different areas where you can go and pick up trash for the day and find a whole lot of like-minded environmentalists and use the opportunity to make the environment around you a better place. And in terms of kind of finding a way to delve into this, I would definitely recommend visiting the Chesapeake Bay Program website, where you can find some of these organizations to connect with and look into what environmental causes you really care about, whether it's blue crabs or land conservation or modeling or climate change preparedness.
Well, I'm also in agreement on both what Kara and Darius said about getting involved, and I definitely can't stress early on just getting involved in different internship and volunteer programs. That was one thing I wish I had done earlier, and it definitely made it difficult for me to get my foot in the door. And then in participating with these different volunteering organizations, also meeting some of those leaders, those community leaders, those the leaders of those organizations, and just making those connections early on and getting advice from them and seeing how they got to where they are and what you could be doing up until that point, just to kind of build your foundation like Darius mentioned.
Right. In your own backyard, you can consider planting trees. If you have any type of pavement, you can maybe plant things around there, use native plants.
So I got more involved with programming and looking at environmental models when I was in college, and this really came out by taking different courses on computer programming. There are lots of free online programs and tutorials. I use R every day, and there are others that live behind paywalls, but there are apps out there you can use to help you learn different coding languages and really just sort of tinker with data sets yourself, try and look at patterns, and there are plenty of people on the web that are willing to help you figure these things out.
So at college, I also worked for the GIS lab, which was a great opportunity. So I definitely suggest people who are interested in the environmental field gaining experience in GIS. I actually just got lost on my college tour, ended up in the lab, and just asked for a job, and I started the first day of school. And I feel like my GIS experience is part of why I have the job I have now. A lot of it is mapping things like easements, government protected lands and things like that, which is very related to my job. So having GIS skills is a big plus in this field. So GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. So it's a big field, but mostly it's a mapping application. So another thing that I do with the Forest Service is helping to increase urban tree canopy, so helping increase the amount of tree plantings in urban settings. In Baltimore City specifically, there are a lot of different organizations that help get the community involved to plant trees and different plants.
So to get the student perspective, for me personally, I know classes available to me include AP Environmental Science, Math and Science Modeling, basically classes where you can learn to do things that are described in like the real world. Like environmental science, you obviously learn about the environment, but you learn how that impacts others, how that impacts you, what you can do for it. Really has a broad impact on like the whole world. And with Math and Science Modeling, you learn a lot about modeling, obviously. It's like population growth, you learn how to map changes. And I feel that there are a lot of opportunities available to us as students to get them. Unfortunately, a lot of people aren't aware of the opportunities they have, and I think it's just important people come together more and bring more awareness to the environment, because you can never stress enough how important it is. You have to make sure your surroundings are good before you can really prosper yourself.